So I couldn't even stitch the video last time. It was so short. So I re-recorded. Sorry. It was like I was delaying the process because I was like, well, maybe I try to stitch it.
The 10 videos.
Because it was crashing like every like minute.
Glad I was in class that day. 'Cause if I wasn't and I had to go back and watch the videos.
No, I re-recorded the video, so it wasn't bad. I just did it late because I was going back and forth about should I re-download the app and stitch the video, which would have cost more time, right? Okay. So kind of a little bit longer assignments today. Oh no, I'm sorry. I opened the wrong file. My brain is still at home. Okay, this is the right file. We're gonna talk a little bit about mobile device control. I think this is such a huge area for enterprises now. It's such a huge tackle for a lot of the admins on how to overcome, and we have to think about the security solutions for mobile devices. Like bring your own device or even the provided device. And then we'll talk about the issues with supply chain and how we can overcome some of the challenges with the proper control. But let me make sure I have caption. So, let me make sure I have captions. So, okay, so the beginning of the notes, it talks about how we are no longer protecting our system based on boundaries. Boundaries were probably 2 decades ago where we use wireless devices. We can set up boundary zones and really protect them, and you can only use your laptop or your mobile devices a certain way. Like back then, it would have been a PDA, and so on. Now I think that because of remote work and how we allow mobile devices in variations, like bring your own device, and we have a lot of variety. Um, you know, when I was putting together the notes and the assignments, and I was thinking about my master's thesis, which was in 2008, I actually wrote a thesis on mobile security. It was very new back then. My thesis was based on like smart devices, like smartphone mobile security. And back then there was an iPhone too, right? Yeah, so that was many, many years ago. And so you would see that. And thinking back, I think that the mobile landscape, how we use mobile devices and also the security has changed. Technology has changed quite a bit in how we adapt security for these mobile solutions, and so on. So when I was writing my thesis, we were only looking at like rooting devices, or jailbreaking was a big thing back then, right? And how we can overcome jailbreaking. But now I think that we have a lot of different ways to really protect your mobile devices. So it talks about challenges on the diversity of operating system and hardware that you have to manage and support overall. And the hybrid approach really allows the business to integrate personal devices for the functionality of the business. Now, on the back end, for the IT and the security people, we have to take a look at how these personal devices impose challenges and how we can overcome them. Okay. So they talk about how there is the tool set that we can use that's considered single pane of glass, which is kind of like a one solve all solution, but we know that out of the box, that's probably not 100% effective. There will be other things that we have to implement in our security solutions. So with that, we should answer some questions. And if okay, so from the first question, it asks you to describe enterprise mobility security management approach. So we know that we have to use a hybrid approach. Approach. Using vendor solutions that allow enterprise owned and personal device to be managed in a single enterprise tool set. And we would refer to this as MDM, uh, which is just a management platform that you would be able to uh, monitor, right, detect, and manage your mobile appliances or mobile systems. So the phrase that the textbook uses is a single pane of glass, which is used to apply control where it's needed. From when you're looking at things like data loss or system theft, right? People can lose their device somewhere. They can misplace it. It can be stolen. Data can be exfiltrated. So in an overall aspect, we're looking at a centralized management approach, but for a hybrid structure, meaning that we would allow companies' own device and personal use device at our facility. Now, what kind of control, and this is going to be a long list, right? It's a big section. There's like many sections combined. So I try to adapt it all into number 2, and it could be more added to this. So how can we implement control for our mobile devices? 1, we would use what we call the MAM, Mobile Application Management Tool. This allows you to control the type of application that we can use on the mobile devices, right? So now the challenge will probably be that I have my personal device, I come to work, I have these apps on my smartphone, right? I will not be able to use the non-allowable apps in the case that I am using the business network. So the ideal way is to use group policy objects, right? If you're looking at Windows centralized management aspect, to control the applications that they can use. So if the user trying to launch an app that's not approved, right, that person won't be able to run the app for the time that they're using it on the network. So your group policy can play a big role in how you can control. Now, if you allow the user to, let's say, bring that device to work and for work only, or you provide them with a smart device for work, you can control the type of apps that are installed on those devices because it becomes a company's property. You can integrate what's called containerization, and this is reiterated throughout the chapter because this is an element that we have to adapt so that way we can protect data. So that means that we would have a container of data for business, and we would have a separate container, which is like a folder or a drive, right? That we would store the data for personal use. And we have to classify those data and be able to protect the data. Now this create a little bit more security. However, it would require more attention to, data permissions or container access permissions. And so we would tie this back into the type of applications that we allow. So let's say that you allow Office 365 on mobile devices, right? You would then be using a container to allow Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Access, etc., right? Those applications data for access. Now, if I'm using something else like Google Docs, right? If that's not permitted, then it would not allow the user to save the data or even access the data. So that's the whole point in containerization, is to tie that back into what is allowed for application. And it goes hand in hand, in my opinion. Um, it is a little bit more work in configuring the setting and which application you allow, what kind of data you allow. And then we want to use multi-factor authentication, whether you implementing USB token or a smart card access. And this goes for, mobile devices or even like laptops, right? You can use USB token to plug into the laptop. That allows the user to input still, right? Like a password, and then use something that they have. So multi-factor is going to elevate the security for authentication. Next, we want to make sure that things are up to date. So we want to make sure patches, especially for the endpoint devices when we're looking at like Android or iOS. So the operating system, the software and the firmware patches that we need. So these two areas. So firmware is crucial. It's code that's gonna allow the system to control different elements or components inside the device, like your microphone, your camera, and all of those things. So um, with that, we want to make sure that we update the firmware and we want to patch the software. And now I think with a lot of the compliant requirements, we have to make sure that these things are regularly done. And then you would need to implement the remote wipe options in the case that the device is missing or stolen. So now we would do this when your data is becoming uncoverable. So let's think about that, right? When you have a mobile device, let's say a laptop, the user uses it at work. Every time that the laptop joins the network or get docked, right? They sync it with a docking station. The data on the laptop is then synchronized with the network drive, where you can um, sync the data, where the data would then be backed up. Now, when that laptop goes to a coffee shop, right? That coffee shop, let's say that they don't remotely log into the network, that laptop being used for personal reasons, um, that laptop goes missing, right? We will have some loss in data. Um, in the case that if the data that they generate in between, let's say that they're working outside of home, you are going to have some unrecoverable data. And we always look at that as in, even with the backup, there's some loss in data and you have to eat that loss. So the remote wipe will allow us to at least, right, making sure that the data on that system is not accessible to anyone else. Um, historical data that would go back and they have built and stored on that laptop, right? And then for wireless connection, now we recommend using WPA3 for authentication. And, in the case if they're using open networks, right, WPA3, and we'll get into that next question, is more beneficial. Okay. I know that, we've been talking about WPA2, but I think WPA3 now is becoming, more popular because of the encryption feature, along with some of the feature that allows you to manage like open public network. So if I'm using my laptop in a public network, which is not recommended, right? But if I need to, using WPA3, which allows me to implement a little bit more security for the actual laptop, and we'll get into that next. Okay. And then we can use certificate to deploy VPN connections, encryption in email, or web application access. So you would then manage your certificate for trusted access and also applications, right? I think most of our applications are web-based now. So certificate management is important. And then I think we spent a chapter on that. So, and then managing profile and customizing the profile that would be suitable for the mobile device. Um, yeah, I was trying to test something with one of the security applications, and hopefully I'll be able to give you that for the lab. Um, but with Debian Linux, sometimes it's a little touchy in how we want to set it up. But you can create device profile that would be suitable for the company. And then you would be able to manage that profile. So let's say that my profile contains rules that doesn't allow the user to install personal apps, right? And this person using the App Store downloaded the personal apps outside from work and try to run the app. What will happen is it will notify my system using security applications. And because the profile is then checking the integrity of that system, has it been changed, right? Even if they can't install that app, and if they are running that app, we can make it. So there are modes that you can make for the profile. It can alert you when they're violating the rules or the policy, or it can prevent or block the user from running the app. Okay. And then important about NFC and Bluetooth, because Bluetooth and NFC allows the user to transfer or share data in an unsecure way. So we want to make sure that we restrict Bluetooth usage. Doesn't mean that we omit Bluetooth overall. There are a lot of, you know, peripherals that uses Bluetooth, but we want to make sure that we regulate this. For NFC, near field communications, right? We know that we can, such as like AirDrop, um, or if you're using Android, right, you can cast to screen. You can use NFC to share files, and this can create data leakage. So we can disable the service unless it's truly required, then we can enable the service for the use and then disable the service again. So ultimately, communication points that is not needed, we want to make sure that we turn that off, right? Or restrict it. Then we can use geofencing to regulate services for the mobile device. And geofencing prevents the user from streaming, taking pictures and share it, connecting to the web and upload data and so on. So geofencing is a way that we can block. So in the high security clearance area, right? Let's say that we have a government agency that doesn't allow people to share business data with the outsider. Geofencing is effective for that. So when they're using the mobile devices in that area, they cannot take picture and upload it. They cannot, stream a video to YouTube from, that facility. Now, geofencing implementation doesn't necessarily is not low cost, right? You know that when you implement geofencing, you have to have appropriate appliances along that be able to detect and block the signal, and then you can go through some of the service provider for that. So, and then we can create VPN profiles that would have settings, that would have rules to ensure there's data confidentiality. So when they're connecting to VPN, right, it would check against the rules that you have. So if the data transmission, make sure that we would have that encryption layer for the transmission. You don't want that to be plain text, because session can be captured and be able to use that externally. And then using screen lock and encryption for access and making sure that we have data privacy. Tethering is actually a common thing for many people personally, right? I don't I don't use it on my device, but I do see a lot of people that I know use it. It's a way that you can share network connection with other device or other people. Um, Now in a business environment, in an enterprise environment, this is not recommended. Because when you are sharing connectivity, likely that someone can attach to that connection point, access the device data, or be able to circumvent the network through that network point. So we want to make sure that we control this by disabling it from the device and then applying the rules that they cannot turn that on. Okay. So simply just a service rule, and even if they turn that on, right, that cannot, we won't allow that for the connection. So if you provide a mobile device for the user to use, you want to have the proper image with the allowed applications and the allowed settings. So that way you don't have to reconfigure each device for thousands and hundreds of the devices. And then we can turn on the airplane mode to protect the device from network-based threats. And we can train the user to do that, right? Most people don't leave their airplane mode on, but in a high security clearance area, a lot of the times they don't allow you to bring smart devices to a sensitive area anyways, right? You have to check in your device. You can only use the organizational provided device. Hello. And then, but you can also require the airplane mode, which doesn't allow network connection. And then we would disable location services for the application to, I don't know why I typed two there. So we wanted to disable the location services for most applications. Okay. Yeah, the only reason why is that apps will share the location, and physical location sometimes is important and sensitive. So we don't want that, right? So we want to also disable that. So this is a big laundry list that we have to look through. There would be more information, but that's get integrated with the other questions. Any questions regarding this? And I can come back to this if you missed something. So that was question number 2. For question 3, we are going to look into the difference between WPA3 and WPA2. WPA2 is currently implemented in many organizations and also for home use. WPA3 is new. It is integrated in some environment, but not yet becoming very popular like WPA2. So the WPA3 uses stronger encryption, looking at GCMP 256 encryption. You can also have AES, which comes with WPA2, right? So the length of your encryption has increased and the type of encryption has improved when you're looking at from one to the other. WPA3 gives you data encryption for each device on the network, where WPA2 uses PSK, the P-share key for all the devices. So when you set up pre-share key, right, that is convenient and easy to use for a lot of the wireless devices, but it doesn't give you elevated protection. So WPA3 gives you individualized data encryption. Next, WPA3 uses SAE, which is known as simultaneous authentication of equals. This allows you to have higher level of authentication because your password um attacks is prevented, right? Like brute forcing or dictionary attack. So compared to PSK, which can be performed with aircraft NG, where we would be able to guess the password with dictionary-based password or password that is commonly used. So when you do away with pre-shared key, I think that we can improve the security area for wireless. And WPA3 includes opportunistic wireless encryption, which is your OWE. This gives you data encryption when you're using public Wi-Fi, right? Going back to the last question, where we say that we want to use WPA3 in an open network. Why? Because of opportunistic wireless encryption, your OWE. And then lastly, um, because it is moving away from the pre-shared key, WPA2 was vulnerable to key reinstallation attack, which is known as crack. If we move away from the pre-shared key, if we use WPA3, our wireless network becomes less vulnerable for such attack. Now, are they going to come up with different ways to attack WPA3? Sure, right? But in the meantime, we are able to secure it a little bit longer, right? That's about just buying time with the existing resources. So when you buy your wireless devices now, right? The new modern wireless device, it's going to come with WPA3 standard. And so if you have this option, you should enable this option on your wireless router, access point, or your wireless mobile devices. Okay, so that's just like a summary of WPA3. You know, I generated this from AI, this list, because, you know, just there are a lot of block-based information, right? That's pulled, but then you have to verify that kind of information. So I have asked AI to verify it and give it to me in a list, and it did that. So it's definitely useful in the aspect if you want to summarize something quickly. Yeah, this was not included in your notes or your chapter. Oh, sorry. The lab. Okay. So the next part we're going to talk about is VPN, virtual private network. We know that we should use VPN whenever we're using wireless devices or mobile device. In an enterprise environment, you should have a VPN profile for the mobile device. And using the profile, we will be able to monitor and track the activities for doing that connection, right? VPN also gives you encryption in connectivity, so it's definitely useful and more secure. We want to ensure that the VPN connection is always available. So in the case when it's needed, the mobile device can use VPN connection. So whether you deploy VPN server and be able to provide that service for your user, or you can provide a third-party service through the organization. So we want to make sure that that's abundantly available for the user. You know, pre-COVID, I think a lot of the companies mostly use VPN for a handful of employees that would need remote work, right? Executives, managers. But because of COVID, I think that the way that we look at remote access and how we can integrate VPN for remote access has changed. There's a higher demand for it. There's better technology that is now available for it. whether you're using web-based or you're using internally supported VPN systems. And so with VPN, we would provide full tunnel configuration for all applications, right? You want to protect the application because they generate data, right? And a lot of the applications are also web-based. So it would tie back to web activity. And then browser activity that would be routed to the company's network using secure protocol like IPsec or IP security, right? So we want to make sure that we implement this option. Any question? Okay, so the recommendation from the notes, and I'm sure that you can look through. Here it talks about application control. We talked about containerization earlier, passwords, multi-factor, patch management and firmware, remote wipe. Here's the wireless section. And then it talks about certificate management for that next section. So coming back to the earlier section, question 5 asks you, how should encryption be used to protect mobile devices in enterprise? Right? Mobile devices tend to get lost and stolen. So we want to make sure that the micro SD, the drive, the internal memory that stores important sensitive data gets encrypted, and this is a must, right? When you go through compliance audit, depending on the compliance requirement, companies provided laptops, tablets, or even in the case that companies allow the people to choose their device or bring their device, you must enforce storage encryption. Whether we encrypt the micro SD that gets detached from the device, or the internal storage system. Now, Microsoft uses BitLocker, but you can use third-party encryption tools or operating system provided tools. So we would be able to encrypt. Now, encryption require resources, right? So we want to make sure that we have the appropriate resources for encryption. And the reason why we do this is because devices can be connected to also a wireless network and for web. And when you do that, right, there's risk in how data can be lost or leaked. Yeah, I was recently notified that my social security number and some of the addresses that I have used in the past is now on dark web thanks to T-Mobile. And that just happened in August, right? So the list that I'm on just was shared on the dark web during August. And then, the recommendation is for me to run my credit reports and all of those things. So I think that nobody is really foolproof. It's sometimes you don't have an option in to protect your own personal data because someone else holds your personal data. And when they leaked your data, right, it would take time for your data to spread. And there are systems that can be used to map where the data goes. But a lot of the times, and you can use scanner to find out like where your data actually goes. But ultimately, right, I am at loss in how my data has gone to the dark web, even, because someone else failed to protect my data, right? So ultimately, you see that when we lose in security solutions, it's usually the customer that loses in the security solutions, or the people that work within the organization, that their data is, their personal data is disclosed. Okay, so for DNS, this is also an area that we have to look at, because is something that domain service is something that the mobile devices can be attached to. So DNS, number one, we know that we should protect DNS records because you don't want DNS farming or poisoning, where they modify the record and redirect your devices to their own servers, right? So we want to use DNSSEC. There's the chapter mentioned that there is DOH, which is DNS of HTTPS. This is a way that you can configure your browser to use TLS for web domains. So I think the majority of your website now require HTTPS, which is, it uses encryption like SSL and TLS service. That means that the majority of our web domains have this capability. However, in the case that if you don't have the encryption capability for web domains, then you should implement DNS over HTTPS. And that is just simply configuring the browser to enforce, right, HTTPS, which is a protocol and a service for web access for that particular domain. And then we want to use VPN connection. So whenever that the user is remotely accessing the company's or the enterprise network, we want to make sure that the queries for the DNS and the enterprise is protected, because ultimately, in order to connect to the domain, the system has to query the DNS, right? Who is this .com and which IP address? So we want to make sure that we have the VPN connection, so that way, in the case if they're sniffing the traffic, that won't be in plain text. And also we are protecting the communication overall for both systems, the client system and the server system. And then we need to filter DNS queries and resolutions to restrict which query they can use, right? And so there are many approaches in this area. You can implement like security appliance for this. You can set up rules, like for the firewall, you can set up proxy. There are many approaches in how you can do the DNS query for the web domains, but ultimately we want to filter that. That means that we only allow specific DNS queries. Because an attacker can generate the same set of queries to kind of probe, right, your DNS. And so if you allow all the queries, you are going to have a lot of probes. So we want to narrow down and limit that, right? Some probes is better than a lot of probes. So we want to make sure that we control the queries. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna forward some of the sections that we kind of touch on, right? It talks about class 2 Bluetooth. Now for class 2, you're able to go from the old class was only like 5 meters. Now you're able to double the distance. So doubling the distance is great for the user who's using Bluetooth, but it is prone to eavesdropping, so someone can sync the channel, right? Bluetooth operates on the ad hoc channel where it changes the channel, so they can use attack tools to attack Bluetooth. And then we talked about NFC, You see this with Google Pay and Apple Pay. Transactional type of system uses NFC, like the tap for your credit card or your ATM. VPN settings. This I didn't include in the assignments, but it talks about geotagging. But we talked about geofencing earlier, right? You should disable this option. And it talks about how you can use applications, but we can monitor some of the activity on the mobile devices through security applications as well. And we'll come to that near the end. Tethering, airplane mode, location services, we touched on. Some of this I didn't include in the assignment. So I think you've heard of this in the prior chapter. What you can do is you can also monitor user behavior, which uses user and entity behavior analytics. UEBA, there are applications or even management system that has this capability. You can install the UEBA packages as an application for your system, so you would be able to log their activities and do the analytics. So you can derive a baseline on the behavior and the activities that they're using, but it also give you the outlier, which you can use for policy control. Okay. And then if you want to track login attempts, right, we can look at impossible time travel. That means that it's gonna look at the time and the duration of the login. Like, most mobile devices use a PIN or biometrics, and they can brute force the PIN, but if we limit the time duration, let's say that 5 attempts and we're gonna lock it out for a certain like an hour or two, right? That just slow down and we'll be able to detect it and research it and detect it or respond to the attack. Okay. So it talks about customizing the DNS settings and then the deployment. Okay, so this section is for the next question. It breaks down to 2 areas. Bring your own device and choose your own device, right? So, and we know that the company can provide a device for you to use at work and also at home, like give you a mobile phone. Okay. That will be ideal because we can do a lot of the control, but how do we manage bring your own device and choose your own device? So for 7, it asks you describe bring your own device challenges and the solutions to overcome. Sorry, I have a typo. To overcome these challenges. So for the bring your own device approach presents the challenges in support and maintenance because you are going to have a lot of different operating systems. If you're looking at iPhone alone, right? Ideally, even the older iPhone should be updated to the latest iOS. However, that's not always the case when the user have their own device, right? They choose not to update. And so there got to be some kind of rule in enforcing what kind of software and hardware that would be allowed, right? So you can come to the consensus on the type of platforms that you're going to use. So there is the support and maintenance in the so many different type of device. Let me move this down so we can see the complete 7. And so our solution would be containerization. We want to separate the personal data from the business data and apply the rules accordingly. We do want to protect the personal data because that belongs to the employee of the organization, and that's also important, right? But the business data can be crucial to operation. That could also be your intellectual property, and a lot of different things. So we want to have the rules that would apply to how the data is accessed and the permissions to control how the data is accessed at the container, at the folder or the drive level, or even cloud. And then we want to use the MDM tools, which is an all-in-one set of management tools to manage and support the personal devices and type. That allows you to drill down on the updates of the OS, the applications that would be allowed, right? And then even going down to certificate and managing the certificate with the applications and so on. So the all-in-one solution for the mobile device management tool, you have to carefully pick this tool to make sure that the tool is appropriate and it has all the features that you need. A lot of the time, software company would sell you the tool out of the box. Ideal, right? We want to be able to test the tools before we decide on the tool. So the solution, there are vast and many. So we want to make sure that the solution would be fitting for the enterprise. And then with the option for choose your own device, that's going to narrow down to the supported or the ideally supported devices options. You can say iPhone version 14 or newer, or Android OS version X is going to be supported, right? Anything outside of that, you know, use at your own risk, which is not true, but yeah. So choose your own, I think is, that would be like the ideal IT management aspect, but usually realistically, that sometimes is not the case. When you apply for work in IT and cybersecurity, they might say, in order to get this job, you have to provide your own laptop, right? And it has to come with Windows 10 or 11, home or professional, and it has to come with an antivirus application. So in order to work in that job, you have to already have the equipment. That means that you have to bring your own device, right? But it's also, they would say that, oh, we will be able to provide you with a smartphone, and these are the models that you can choose from. And that becomes choose your own. So in that case, you're going to have a hybrid environment, and they will be able to support your laptop when you are remotely connecting to their network to do scans or to, generate reports or whatnot. And then, they would be able to contact you at any time in the day using the smartphone, based on what they can provide for you, right? The mobile service along with the smartphone. I usually opt out on the smartphone because I do not want to be contacted all time in a day. But in some positions like IT management, security, first responder, they are going to contact you anytime because an incident can happen at 1 a.m. in the morning, right? In the middle of your sleep, and you are going to have to log in and respond to an incident. So, your team is going to contact you and you must respond, right? You can't just turn it off and go to sleep. So, that's part of the nature of the job, and that's what you're going to have to do. Any question? Okay, so let's go through and answer some of these questions based on the given scenario. So we have to choose the appropriate security solutions given the scenario. A, ABC Corporation faces unauthorized remote activation and deactivation of Android devices or feature, meaning that they can go and buy an unlocked device, right? And a lot of times now you can self-activate, right? You just get a SIM, you put that SIM in, you would contact or use your network to connect to your mobile network, or you can talk to an agent on the phone, sometime AI, to be able to automate that activation process. So in that case, we want to use secure Linux, right? Um, I will show you some resources where you can look up secure Linux. SE Linux is equipped with many releases, but before you activate this, make sure you check the requirement and look at the documentation. Okay. I originally wanted to implement SE Linux for Kali, but certain Debian version, you have to install a bunch of things before you can get it to work. So, but you can definitely look into like Ubuntu with SE, Red Hat with SE, Linux, and so on. Now, for Android environment, you can use an extension. This is known as an extension. Maybe just think of it like uh, a set of code that you can add on to the system, and it functioned very similar to SE Linux. Now, SE Linux, the beneficial side of this is that your root level privilege is still control, right? It does mandatory access control. So this is why people argue that Linux is more secure. Um, you know, when we start a discussion that way, I usually say secure with what factor, right? There are many different factors. Like you can use Linux completely unsecure. But in the sense where you can add in modules or elements or feature to your Linux system, because SE is equipped with most releases, right? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily activated. So when people argue that Linux is more secure, in what sense, right? It just there's more malware developed for Windows compared to Linux, but now Android is growing, right? So the argument doesn't stand. It's very generalized. So, but if you say that Linux is more secure when you're using SE Linux, that is understandable, right? So, the people who say that Linux is more secure, usually they don't know security. So, so, um, the debate continues, right? Okay. So you should also implement MDM for the mobile devices, like the Android devices, so that way you can control the apps and how the system gets activated as well. B, an employee uses the mobile device to commit data theft by scanning and uploading data to an external cloud drive. This happens a lot, right? When you're looking at hospitals, when you're looking at a lot of like secret, highly sensitive area, um, sometimes people take pictures, and you see sometimes you get these really crazy video with millions of views, right? When they're not supposed to be reporting, but they're sharing it, and they can make the money from based on the views or whatever. But the legal consequences, the repercussion behind that can be very daunting, right? But to really prevent this, you need to really apply the rules. Later on, we're going to look at some of the modules that we can use to make sure. So you can apply some rules in that we can disable the camera on the device, right? If you do geofencing, they cannot upload anything. But geofencing is expensive and it requires a lot of management capabilities. And so we need to assess the physical reconnaissance. So in the case where you implement the policy, you need to test it. You need to test it as a user, right? Can I record a 5-second video? Can I, take my phone and take a picture of something like a patient file and send that out, email it to myself, and then go home and upload it somewhere else or sell it. Um, and then you need to also, going back to UEBA earlier, we need to survey, right, with video along with monitor their activities. If you have overlapping solutions, it's always ideal because you cannot just rely on the software to automate and manage and making sure that the rules are followed. People, um, people's behavior is a lot harder to control because sometimes it will be outlier. Like you're gonna have one employee one day show up and commit something. But most of the time, normally they operate in their own roles and they follow the rules. On a bad day, something can happen. So you are going to have some different aspect and factor in human behavior that you cannot predict. Um, no matter how good of your AI would be, right? You can have a model that would predict the behavior of most of your employees, but then this is why we have school shooting and a lot of different things that are happening because that one day, right, that outlier action can just crumble everything. So we want to make sure that we prepare for those things. And so if you have overlapping solutions, it's always ideal. And then the area of personal health information. Personal health information was leaked from an employee's wearable device. And this could be like their heart rate, their insulin level, their, uh, you know, and wearable device, IoT is a whole different area of mobile devices that you need to tackle, right? So wearable devices is the firmware is an area that is most problematic. They don't update firmware as should be. So if you're using the health bracelet, right, if you look into the vulnerability, the CVEs behind that, you are gonna see tons, right? Apple Watch, Samsung devices, so on. So a lot of the times we need to patch. You need to disable Bluetooth and NFC because that is just basically proximity data leak. Someone can reach the device by attacking it using Bluetooth and NFC. Eavesdropping, right? Listening, grabbing the data. Um, is that of important? I think personal health data sometimes can be important. They can use that for prescription. They can use that for a lot of different things. Um, you know, so because there are rules and requirement that we have to make sure that we protect personal identifiable information and health information in organizations, right? We have to make sure that we have security protection for the device. You need to enforce wireless security connectivity. We talked about WPA3, along with how we should wirelessly connect these devices. Right? Now, people won't learn until they have a hard lesson. So, but let not be that hard lesson be the only way that they learn. So it's difficult for someone to understand the aspect, the dynamic of how that data can really impact their life until it happens, right? Same thing with organization. Um, the negative impact will always be a big imprint for business and people, unfortunately, right? But it keeps us working, and that's the nature of the game. Is a lot of times we work because there's negative impact. And then you should use containers and encryption to make sure that you secure the sensitive data. And for HIPAA requirement, right, you have to protect. But for personal data on personal wearable devices, you have to manage this too, right? So we want to make sure. Now, wearable devices can be for people, patients, um, to be able to monitor their heart rate at the hospital, um, It could be for prison system. That is also very common to be able to track people. So we want to make sure that we, they use a smart bracelet to track prisoners to make sure that they're healthy and, you know, um, other things too, right? Track where they are and track their whereabouts and things. I'm sorry? Yeah, ankle monitors. Yeah, but I think that, they're doing ankle monitors is really proximity tracking, right? But in the prison system, smart devices can go a long way. It would track to see if, they're healthy, they're actually, doing the things that keep themselves normal, right? So I think that, we're transitioning to technology on how we integrate and we look at things that would be useful in society, but then also the security aspect of it as well. And then D, an unauthorized application that was installed in an executive's mobile device. This allows sideloading by restricting jailbreaking. Yes, people still jailbreak and root their systems, um, and then applying the policy using, and it might sound redundant, but a lot of the times it comes back to some of the very simple things, right? Don't use your system at root level, basically. And then, prevent installation of non-approved apps. So the textbook talks about, like Apple Store Apple App Store requires the apps to go through approval, and same thing with Samsung and Microsoft. Developers cannot release apps on there unless it has security measures and things. But you have to think about how the data of the app is maintained. We tend to overlook, right? You tend to think about performance of the app, the permission of the apps. But the permissions a lot of time ties with the data of the app. So if the app is activating your camera system and your microphone, that data that it gathers goes somewhere, right? And how are they maintaining your data? And that, there's questionable things about TikTok and how they manage TikTok data and all of those things, right? So always a debate. But one of the things that was mentioned, and I think that's important to highlight, is Xcode. Xcode is an IDE or an interface where you can write and test um, your code in Apple systems. So if someone install Xcode, they can run unapproved code or scripts on the systems. So you would be able to track that if you have the appropriate security solutions. So you would see that there's activity, right, when it's running that code. Anything that's executable, right, it's gonna block it and then it's gonna notify. Okay. So for supply chain and mobile devices, and I think that only has like a small section. I think it's gonna come back and highlight with the IoT down the line as far as the textbook. But the two areas that you should look at is AddUps and eFuse. AddUps is the software that's used to monitor user behavior. They do this like just like how we talked about earlier, right? Prison system, they might have a software to be, but anyway, so this software is used to monitor user behavior, but on an Android system. However, right, it creates a backdoor that access the call logs, contact lists, messages, and location tracking. So that exposes private information about that particular device and personal information for the user that uses that device, right? Like contact information, messages, right? If they're sending private messages to family members and things, that also get leaked, right? So it is a security issue. eFuse, it's designed to protect mobile device integrity, right? So this is the double blade sword, right? Both of these. eFuse is like electrical fuse, but it protects electrical devices that are mobile. But it can be tripped when you have an unsigned bootloader, unsigned kernel, or scripts that are running. So the only way that they will be able to do this is at root level, right? For the Android device or the embedded Linux device. And when that happens, it disable access to secured container. And it's going to generate updates from trusted to untrusted source. So this creates vulnerability for the system, as it might contact untrusted source to push updates or install various updates, along with using unsigned bootloader kernel, which could be malicious. It's documented, so you know that there have been cases, right? I think in the notes provided you with the link, you can read more about it. I'm sure that you can find information on Mitre regarding these areas, right? These technologies. So what kind of control can we implement? So let me move this down to one page. Sorry, these are kind of long. So one, we need to choose trusted hardware and software platforms. And we need to use attestation services for cloud to make sure that there's strong security. We need to protect the system from unauthorized changes using HIDS, which is your host-based intrusion detection system. That means it's just an application to detect any kind of change. So it checks the integrity of the system to see if there's any system files or system structure that's been modified, right? That's the job of that application. And then in host intrusion prevention system. So when you use security software, right, now we have the all-in-one security software. It does do that, right? It has a way to see if there's anything like your bootloader has been modified or anything has been modified or changed over time. And if it does, it notifies or blocks it. So the prevention blocks, the detection only sends an alarm. We would use EDR, which is endpoint detection and response software, to detect threats that are sophisticated, that are undocumented, that would be generated from APT, right? Or that would be zero-day exploits. Those are newer and more advanced threats. So EDR handles complex, recent, or very new activities or behavior that is not defined. So how does it do that? It checks abnormal activities against the system, right? So behavior analysis. And then the fourth point is to harden your mobile device. And this is going to give you defense in depth, right? You want to remove unnecessary services. So protocols is tied to services. It's tied to ports. So if you disable those services and, the apps uses services as well, That's gonna remove some of the vulnerability from your system. Disable unused accounts. That's also important, right? Because unused accounts can sit there over time, and an external source can utilize one of the accounts, and unknowingly the user would then store sensitive data, and that data would be leaked. So there's many scenario in the unused accounts and how that can be eliminated. We should eliminate unused accounts. We should apply security rules or policy to make sure that we have appropriate access for the account. Any question? So obsolescence management is about retiring your device. Like when it becomes less used or no longer used. So as the time run out on the device, and normally this is what, every 5-7 years, if it is if it is not as frequently used. If it is frequently used, sometime it's up to 5 years, but normally 3 years. Depending on also the quality of your mobile device. So before we retire anything, we need to assess the risk impact of that device being removed. So in a hospital scenario, let's say that you have, you know, mobile devices that the nurse use for patient health monitoring. We want to, before we actually retire that, business department actually assess, right, the cost of removing those devices versus the cost of continue to maintain those devices, right? That's the conversation between IT and business, and that happens all the time. If we continue to maintain these devices and replacing them, how much would that be a year, right? They would say, oh, $150,000, whatnot, compared to if we get rid of these devices and make the nurse and the doctors manually monitor patients' health, how much would that cost? So you weigh the risk and you look at ultimately it comes down to the dollars in the decision-making process, right? Usually. So you have to look at the risk impact. Now, on the technical side, the risk impact could be that when you remove that device, right, it could be positive risk or negative risk. The positive risk would be that it would improve the security of your wireless network, that now these devices are not on the networks anymore. The negative side is that sometimes removing that mobile device can have a negative impact. Performance of your system can go down, right? Let's say that it is a mobile appliance that you use, maybe just to monitor all your autonomous system or whatnot. That can also remove some of the automation results, and that would require the user to the technician to then manually monitor, which creates error, right? I believe that human generates a lot more error than the computer. So so there's some risk impact that you have to look at. And then identify the devices that are no longer supported in the case that the vendor is no longer supporting the device. Or let's say that you're looking at laptops, right? Microsoft would announce that it would retire Windows 7 at this year, and you should not have Windows 7 laptops anymore. If you don't upgrade it to Windows 10 or Windows 11, you should retire that laptop. Number one, hardware might be outdated or it's limited, so you cannot upgrade because you have upgraded from Windows XP era. And I've had cases like that, where people don't want to buy new systems and they continue to use that. And Windows 7 is at the max, right? Because it has 4 gig of RAM and dual core. So we can say, okay, we can run Windows 10, but you can't run any application on top of it unless you buy a new system. So And they would say, no, we don't want that. We'll just look into a different type of system with the new OS. So we'll just get rid of these, right? And then you have to think about like how you're gonna integrate the legacy application onto the newer systems, and that's a whole different project for deployment. So you would then think about like, retiring these, but continue to use the application and then, or upgrade the application for the newer OS, the newer system, um, which incur costs, time, and effort. So it's a catch-22. This is why I do not want to do IT management. Question. Okay. So some of the sections you can go over, pretty light read, right? Earlier, I think we talked about side loading. We want to make sure that we track all the insulation on the system. I guess this is an area that we should also address. Um, unlocked devices sometimes can use, any kind of SIM card. Along with that, they will be able to add to other networks, right? Bring your own device can be flexible in that area, but also on the management side can also be daunting in that you got to make sure that the user understand that they must use a certain mobile network, and they have to use the approved SIM and all of those things. SIM stores a lot of information. I think most of you have done forensics, so or taken the class, so you know that SIM store a lot of personal information on the SIM. Okay, the section we just talked about, hardening techniques. Retiring devices. Okay, so this is for the next question is NX and XN. So Intel and AMD provided a module to prevent the CPU from executing a certain set of code at the low level. It helps us enhance security. So no execute is NX, and this is a feature that's provided with AMD. And then never or execute never is with Intel. Okay. And then if you're using ARM, and ARM is in Snapdragon now in Apple has their own version of ARM architecture, right? Which is in your new processor that you have for your new iPhone and your tablets. So you would see that ARM RISC architecture uses, I think, XN. I think it talks about that here. Yeah, XN bit. So this is just a bit or a security feature that prevents application from utilizing a certain part of your memory. Okay. So the technologies that we would use for RAM protection and system memory protection, we can use no execute, which had a cutoff here. I had a wrong cutoff. 64-bit AMD, and then your ARM and Intel uses XN, which is execute never. and that is to protect the memory storage. So it prevent code execution in a certain part of memory. We know that the OS does this already, right? The OS has a protection level for the system where the user level privilege cannot intervene. But in the hardware level, you need to have this particular security measure as well. So that way you don't have buffer overflow, you don't have low level execution of processes for malware. Um, does that still happen? It does, right? You see this with rootkit and other things. Um, but but the CPU, the way it's designed for the consumer, is now have this element. So that's good to know, right? So you can't execute arbitrary commands or repurpose a certain area of the memory to execute a certain system command. 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, you don't see this type of technology, right? We think of different ways now to logically and physically protect the system from hardware to software level, which is great. So why should the CPU virtualization be disabled, right? When you're using virtual machine on your system here, your virtualization support is enabled, right? You cannot run a virtual machine without this feature enabled. So you have to go to the BIOS of your computer and turn it on. But in a mobile environment, let's say a laptop, and you don't want the user to run the virtual machine so they can execute codes and things, right? You know that there is virtualization sprawling where we can have it connected to the host system and share the connectivity where we would be able to interchange file. You can do that in VirtualBox too, or VMware, any kind of hypervisor. So because virtualization supports allow virtual images to be launched in hypervisor, which is the software, and it would allow the user to run unauthorized applications and things, right? So you to prevent that, you should turn your virtualization support off. So in Intel, you should turn, I think it's VT, virtualization technology. You just turn that off, and that would take care of it. So that it can be in UEFI or BIOS, and you just disable it. Okay. And then we also should restrict shell, PowerShell and Linux shell, um, or any form of shell. So why should we restrict shell? Because yeah, you create your own user account groups, and that happens a lot, right? Um, PowerShell is powerful. So if you have access to PowerShell, you can make yourself an account. You can add your account to different groups, and there you go. You can also change permissions to data. Um, so a lot of people don't think about that. They're like, well, if the user doesn't have access to account management console, they won't be able to do that. But hey, they have command line, and if they, so you have to disable commands and you have to disable shells, right? Shell can also run scripts, and scripts can be dangerous. So you can automate things. So internal threats is harder to detect in that if they are very knowledgeable, it's very difficult to track, and control their activity. So better off, right? We want to disable command line interface and other things. So this is why when you go to the store, right? Like I'm going to use Coinstar for example. You can only do one activity in Coinstar is to deposit coin and cash in on your coins, right? That's one thing. The ATM machine is the same thing. You can deposit, you can withdraw, right? Check your account information. It's just for the purpose of the ATM machine. It's still a computing system in the back. Can they put an operating system with an icon where you can tap? Yeah, you sure can. It's still running an OS in the back, and the updates is still through the OS, right? Um, and Coinstar, from what I know, is still Windows in the back. So can they still have the taskbar and all of those things? They can. So when you strip away the interface for the application, you do see Windows still running in the back. However, right, they're not going to present you that so that way you can access command line and be able to, you know, empty everything in the container, all the coins, right? And so on. So it's funny how um I watch movies of people like rob an ATM machine, right? And then try to break it open. Yeah, you ever seen those movies? Yeah, they struggle to break it open because there's process behind it, right? Number one, it doesn't physically open. It has to be logically open, right? Because it's a computer system. Even though there's a key that, you see that they come in the armored truck and they open that, they put the cash in, but there's also a logical key that you have to open through the actual computing system, right? So, um, and the service technician that comes to service the ATM, you often see that they have guards with them because they can open at both level. So they run the software updates and those things. Yeah, I patched some of the ATM systems in the past. Back then, I didn't have no arm guards or anything. You just bring CDs and you connect a laptop and you patch it. Okay, so we want to block shell. Sorry, let me put this down. So we have the entire answer. We want to block shell application access for most user accounts. We want to remove administrative privilege for command execution for users, right? So as user accounts, a lot of the time they don't have privilege as administrator anyways. But if there's a flaw in your application access, you want to make sure that you control that, right? Because anyone can sudo with the right password, correct? 14. The purpose of address space layout randomization, your ASLR, and why should we enable this feature on the system? Its purpose is to protect computer systems from attacks against memory, like buffer overflow. When enabled, this feature prevents the attacker from being able to use random memory addresses, right? So they can write a script to create container or variables or arrays or lists everywhere, right? That's such a simple script. Just loop and then just keep making container and then put arbitrary values into those container, and you can use the random number generator for that. So, but it prevents the memory addresses from being generated because we using, dynamic storage. That means that it just pulls available addresses and be able to accumulate that for when the code is executed. So ASLR prevent that from happening because it's going to look at the memory address prediction and being able to control that. So that's a plus, right? We want to use that. So when we have preventative measure like this, you know that something already happened. So they had created a tool to be able to prevent that. And then for 15, describe patch management approach for mobile devices. First, you want to identify all your assets. So you need to do asset inventory and ensure automated patching is enabled. Second, you want to plan your patch. So we want to schedule it, and we want to plan accordingly. So you have to have the proper resources. Um, Normally in an enterprise environment, you have a servers that store or a database that store all your patch and the configuration of your system. But we should fully test all the updates before we deploy the updates, right? Even though it's the latest, it could cause interruption or failure of applications and OS. As you've heard about some of the recent updates with CrowdStrike, yeah, where it changes the low level um, of the Windows operating system, and then that creates a lot of interruption, especially for airlines like Delta, right? And then we should routinely update firmware to reduce vulnerability for mobile devices. So firmware should also include with the list along with the software like operating system and applications. Okay. So we should automate this as much as you can. Okay. So why is logging and monitoring important in mobile devices and enterprise? So in security, logging and monitoring is crucial no matter what, because continuous monitoring is going to give us um, alerts, or it would notify us if there's changes in configuration or any irregular or anomalous activity relating to the device. So if there's anything that changes the device integrity, and or in the behavior of the device, or in the case that if the device becomes um, it's not conforming to the policy that we had set, or it violates the policy. Now, malware infection tends to do that. It changes the nature of the state of the device through system settings and also infecting system files. Or in the case of attacks, right? Maybe they place a backdoor on the system or whatnot. So when you monitor, you should be able to detect it. So we want to have early detection. And then we want to be able to respond to the threat. So that's important. And logging is going to give you accountability, right? The record, so that way you can go back and find out what the issue is and fix the problem. Okay. The next part, it's gonna go into mandatory access control for your notes. It's toward near the end, but we still have a few more questions. So SE Linux, you might have heard of this before. It's incorporated mandatory access control model, which requires, right, a certain privilege for accounts. It's carried for all accounts in Linux that has SE Linux module incorporated. However, right, if you're looking at all the Linux releases that uses SE, the root privilege is also controlled. So you have root account in Linux with SE Linux that is enforced. It enforces if you use the enforcing setting, right, in SE Linux, it's going to apply the policy across. So there's implementation for SE Linux. Now, before you use SE Linux, you want to make sure that you check the requirements of SE Linux, because, right, even though it is available to most of the releases, the requirements is of important because some releases might not be able to adapt, or it needs additional plugins or other things in order for it to run accordingly. And then for SE Android, and we said that this is an extension for the Android platform. How is this important for Mac? You can have control for the services with Damon for misuse. So in the case that you have infection or attack that capitalize on your services, um, it would be able to, we can manage that with the SE Android. And then if using it, you should be able to sandbox your application and then apply the policy um to for the restriction. With this, it's better to create profile and then apply the policy for the profile. And let me move it all up so we can see all of it. And the security is included in the kernel, right, for that Linux release. It uses middleware mandatory access control, or MAC, which allows application privileges to be assigned during the installation and at runtime. So when you run the application, it entails appropriate privilege for the application. So in this case, it is secure because at the kernel level, there's already protection. And then you just have to implement SE Android using enforcing setting, but it is defaulted enforced. So if you use a lot of Android systems, you want to consider implementing SE Android for more control. All three like that. And then only a couple more, a few more, and then we'll be done with the lecture. Time went by so fast. I feel like Thursday was just yesterday. Yeah, it is.
And I hate that it gets dark fast.
Yeah, we're gonna have daylight saving pretty soon, the end of the month. But it give you a chance to go to bed sooner. And the weather just make you want to go to sleep sooner.
Weather just makes me want to sit by a fireplace.
Or hot chocolate. Tea. And snacks. Any question? Time to bring out all the sweaters and the coats. California doesn't get too cold. They're only like February, I think January and February kind of get a little chilly. A little bit of December near Christmas, right? The only time we get cold is when we have wind or rain.
Randomly in like March.
Oh yeah. It's the rain that we had and it got that cold front coming through. Chance to play in the snow. And a winter give you a chance to play in the snow. I'm getting too old for that now. I'm afraid to go snowboarding. It's always like that the first time you try. You get better. Do you want me to move? I'm sorry, some of you are still writing the other ones. I'll move this down, the two, so we can see. Sorry about that. Some of these answers are kind of long. So. Okay, so we can preview 19. So earlier we mentioned that cloud attestation is one of the element that we want to incorporate for mobile devices, right? We want to expand on that. How are, sorry, should be R. So the services is going to allow you to have secure values that would then be forwarded to your hardware device, to an attestation service. So it generates a value that would be sent to the device that is for that service. And if the device is registered, right, the host of the trusted platform module, so this is a module that's integrated with the likely your processor, right? It would then store that value and it cannot be changed. So that will give you a little bit more trusted and secure in that it is a trusted value. Think of it that way. That would then be stored on the hardware. Okay. Now, this is, important for your cloud server in the case that if you're using like web application for cloud, or that's hosted on the cloud. So we want to make sure that the values is then generated, right? So this is just a service that you would have both. It is tied to your hardware and making sure that it's not physically tampered for the trusted module. So how can you integrate other type of modules such as hardware security module, your HSM, to secure storage of encryption keys? And this is not hardware dependent or hardware independent. It's integrate HSM appliances. So basically you would add these systems, and these systems is going to store blockchain-based crypto keys. And in order to obtain the keys, if you understand blockchain, right, it is a group of keys to get the key. It's kind of like you have a key locker for your keys. In order to access your main key, right, you have to open up all of these other key locker in order to obtain it. Yeah, to get the master key. So the whole point is to really slow down, right? Blockchain have been known to be circumvented already. You see with cryptocurrency. In time and resource, with time and resource, everything is reachable. But the whole point is to have a dedicated device that utilize the module for encryption. So we would encrypt the storage that store the keys for other encryption, right? So in order to access the other keys, you have to utilize the keys to open the other keys, and that other key is to decrypt the data. Okay, so it's just another resource for you to protect keys for decryption. And then I want to highlight M-measure boot, or known as measure boot, right? This is PRC values that is validated with the trusted platform module, your TPM, which is integrated with your processor most of the time. and it is stored as blockchain hashes. So it means that several values can be combined to a single hash value. So in order to compute that hash value, it, in order for someone to compute that hash value, we want to make sure that there are we have to compute the values for a single hash value. So it is also another way to buy time is because can you reverse engineer and be able to predict the hash value? Only if you can predict the other values, right? And in the case that even if you have a powerful system prediction for one encryption or to break an encryption for a hash prediction it takes time and a lot of resources. And so in blockchain technology, you're going to have one to the next, to the next, to the next. So you have multiple, right, hashes to generate one hash. Okay. So it's buying time once again, just like what we talked about in the last one. Question? And then 22, self-healing software and fairly new technology. This is a way that we can increase resilience for enterprise system. When you use such application, and Microsoft has REFS, this is used to scan the integrity of the system, especially the drives. And then in the case where if there's flaws or trouble or issue in the system, it would then fix the problem, right? So it constantly would check the health of the system. And if there's issues with the system health, right? Like in the case if there's drives that could be repaired, it would then be able to fix that problem. So as we are moving a lot more into automation, this is going to become a lot more popular. You do see there are some solutions that are integrated for self-healing, right? So you should ask, well, then what makes IT support then, right? Well, we have to configure these self-healing systems to be able to maintain. Because there's a lot of discussion about how AI and AI integration and automation changes the dynamic of the industry and the need of the industry. In cybersecurity, there's still a lot of human factor that is part of the decision process. So you still have to make a decision. And even with the prediction and the decision model and the decision tree in how we integrate it with the prediction for AI, I really feel that we still have the human component, because there are times that we have to make a decision on things that are obscurely outlier compared to, it's easy to really build a model to make a decision based on, your baseline or your normal behavior, right? But we have outstanding things that we have to take a look at. And eventually we'll teach the machine to do that, right? To really replace some of the effort that we are doing, and then we will move on to higher decision-making process. And I really feel that, have no fear, right? And then you also need to make sure that your AI system is secure, because even if it's self-healing in some point, there's still a lot of maintenance behind it. So, all right. Any question? Okay, let's do a break. I'm gonna stop recording. Get some snacks.
I think that was like the longest note we've taken so far.